Can we say it's down to the digital age? Not only has the world become a smaller place, but now more and more power is concentrated into fewer and fewer hands. Take Elon Musk's offer to buy the parent company of ChatGPT from Sam Altman's OpenAI, just the latest example of a whole new age, an age where a billionaire like Musk can also have one foot in government, as he and Donald Trump arbitrarily purge the federal payroll. Altman, who by the way swiftly rejected Musk's offer, is here in Paris for the AI summit co-hosted by France and India. Are Silicon Valley tech titans to be courted or combated at the dawn of an almighty scramble for the planet's data and resources? Is it a battle for market share or a battle for values? In writing global governance rules for AI, who defines what's public and private, what free speech is, what censorship or stoking hate is, and how much in common between those that are neither the US nor China in setting global standards that actually protect citizens' rights and foster trust in these most turbulent times? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at superpowers in the age of tech titans. With us, she was one of two journalists to interview Emmanuel Macron in prime time Sunday evening. Palki Sharma, managing editor of First Post. Thanks for being with us here on France.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome to Paris.
Thank you.
Welcome as well to Sharad Sharma, co-founder of the iSpirit Foundation, which thinks about how tech is evolving. Welcome.
Thank you.
He is the former French ambassador to India. Claude Blanche-Maison, the author in French of, in French it's L'Inde contre vents et marées, India against, how would you say it? India will prevail is how you...
I think so. I think it will be the best translation. India will prevail.
Okay, we'll ask you why. And Jen Schrady, associate professor at the Center for Research on Social Inequality at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Good to see you.
Happy to be here.
And from Washington, Tanvi Madan, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution think tank. Thank you for being with us from across the waters of the Atlantic.
Good to be with all of you.
Your reactions on the hashtag F24debate. It's a small world after all, goes the song. World leaders posing at the Grand Palais Museum here in Paris for the AI Action Summit. A family photo, a happy family it seems. But note that there's people missing from that photo. The U.S. representative to this summit, Vice President J.D. Vance, not in the picture. By the way, he got up and left at Monday's presidential banquet when it was the Chinese vice premier's turn to speak. Also absent, he stayed away entirely from the French capital, the UK Prime Minister. Neither the US nor Britain signing a joint statement that calls for ensuring AI is open, inclusive, transparent, ethical, and trustworthy, and making AI sustainable for people and the planet. 3 weeks into the Guardian newspaper quoting a Labour MP, by the way, as saying, I think we have little strategic room but to be downstream of the US. There's a real risk OpenAI, Xi, Anthropic cut off UK AI Safety Institute access to their latest models, giving how hands-off Trump is becoming. Now that's one Labour MP speaking off the record. But does it feel like the UK was cowed into not trying to stir the United States at this time? What does that tell you about the times we live in, Jen Schrade?
Well, certainly we've seen this massive change after the 2016 Brexit, Cambridge Analytica scandal, et cetera. There started to be a lot more guardrails in tech. And what we've seen dramatically over the last few years is so many of those safety features have been eliminated. Meta has downsized X, formerly known as Twitter, as well. And, you know, we can talk about these state powers and what's happening at the AI summit about these issues, but really who has the power right now are these tech billionaires.
And the UK Prime Minister not commenting directly on why he didn't sign on to this. I mean, it's a pretty innocuous joint statement, but is it the case probably the UK is that scared of the United States at this point?
I mean, I think there's a lot going on, and I think that really what we're seeing is that there's a lot behind the scenes, right? So Trump is blowing a lot of, smoke publicly, but what's really going on behind the scenes, I think, is really relevant here. And again, it's not only from the U.S. government, but it's also from big tech that could threaten to pull out of the UK, et cetera.
So you agree, Sharad Sharma, if you're not the world's most populous nation or the member of a 27-nation bloc like the European Union, you'd better think twice before upsetting the United States when it comes to tech these days?
Yes. Unfortunately, that is true. And I think this collision or this combination of state power and tech power is scaring everybody off. I mean, this used to happen only in China.
Is this unprecedented? I mean, in the age of
and
is this unprecedented that there's this kind of collusion that you describe?
I think so. I think we saw this happen in nuclear technology back in time. There was a little bit of this we saw with CRISPR and therefore vaccines, but this is happening at a scale that we have never seen before. And so I think there is a need for another paradigm to emerge, which is going to put citizen rights and citizen agency at the center. And you cannot rely on the US system to deliver that to you. You can't rely on the Chinese system to deliver that to you. So there is a third system that you need. Maybe India and France can come together and pull something off here.
All right, we're going to talk about that, about whether India and France can come together. Just a point, 3 weeks into a new U.S. administration, it's certainly too soon to burn bridges for France's president, Emmanuel Macron, rolling out the red carpet for Monsieur and Madame Vance on their first foreign foray since Inauguration Day. The new U.S. vice president was his first big policy speech since January 20th, hailing AI as, quote, a new industrial revolution on par with the invention of the steam engine, but also putting Europe on notice.
Many of our most productive tech companies are forced to deal with the EU's Digital Services Act and the massive regulations it created about taking down content and policing so-called misinformation. And of course, we want to ensure the internet is a safe place, but it is one thing to prevent a predator from preying on a child on the internet, and it is something quite different to prevent a grown man or woman from accessing an opinion that the government thinks is misinformation.
Claude Blanche-Maison, what are your thoughts when you hear the new U.S. Vice President talk about so-called misinformation?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important that this AI summit took place in Paris, in Europe, and was co-chaired by the Prime Minister of India, maybe to show that there is a third way between the US and China, because, of course, the biggest power is obviously the US. I mean, that's a fact.
But is that a threat we just heard from J.D. Vance?
Well, I think it's also good that the Vice President of the USA came to this meeting. He could have sent somebody of a lower level, but he came in the way, and it was quite obvious that probably there would be some divergence between the US and the rest, and he didn't sign the final communique.
When he says so-called disinformation, is it so-called disinformation? Is it mythical disinformation? Or is there genuine disinformation problem?
It's what Donald Trump is saying very regularly. So it's not a surprise that his vice president is using the same language.
Palki Sharma, are you as zen as Ambassador Blanche-Maison there?
Are you surprised that J.D. Vance is saying what he's saying? Isn't that what their politics has been about? Isn't that what they've been elected to office for? This is what they say, and this is what they probably believe in. Is it good for the world? Definitely not. But these are the cards that we've been dealt, and the world will have to figure a way out.
Does that sound like he wants to sanction Europe over its Digital Services Act?
Well, his president has been talking about sanctioning Europe about a lot of things and imposing tariffs and so on. So they talk, and I think their entire strategy is shock and awe and see where it takes them. So I wouldn't read too much, or I'm not really surprised with the tone that J.D. Vance is taking and the fact that they're not signing on the joint statement. After all, AI is the new great game, and we are, like you said in your introduction, figuring out terms of engagement, and this is a competition that the world finds itself in. And so the powers that be, the powers like the United States, which are clearly ahead of the rest of the world, are trying to secure their terms.
Do you think we'd be at a place where, on a statement like this one, China would be signing on, but not the United States?
I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised because China has already challenged the United States in its game and challenged them quite effectively. And now the world is looking at a third way out. And the US, with all its chips and its AI might, is trying to still figure out how the rest of the world should respond to artificial intelligence. And they are going to need the markets. ChatGPT is India's second biggest market after the United States. So when they pick a fight with the rest of the world, they should know where are they going to sell their wares.
All right, so for those of you who are not in Paris, it's kind of a balancing act, what was just witnessed by panelists who attended the summit. On the one hand, how do you put common rules in place? How do you make governance cohesive around the globe? On the other hand, want to try to attract those investors. Emmanuel Macron seemed to anticipate what J.D. Vance would say when he addressed investors at the summit's opening on Monday.
We will have more private investment. We will have more public investment. We will announce new strategies. But we are, most of the time, too slow. And I got the message for the investors today again. So I told them we will adopt the Notre Dame de Paris strategy. I mean, we showed the rest of the world that when we commit to a clear timeline, we can deliver.
So Tanvi Madan, some trademark French humility in that statement there. Just wanted to ask you, though, when he says, you want less red tape, I get the message investors. Does he get the message from investors, or does he get the message from the new administration in Washington? Is that to appease Donald Trump?
I think there are a couple of things here. I think one is, just to your point about China signed on and the US didn't. China signs on to a lot of agreements that it doesn't actually stick to. So I wouldn't put much in that. On the subject of kind of the US and what President Macron said, I think this is a philosophical difference, an ideological one that revolves around free speech issues. So the US vice president, and as Ms. Sharma said, this is what the Trump administration, the Trump campaign ran on, that they thought big tech was censoring. So they see some of this I suspect when they see some of these documents and talking about AI safety and other issues, they're reading it as censorship. Now, Europe and India have free speech rules that are much more similar to each other with caveats for protection, for example, of minorities, etc. The US has a much more expansive one. So this isn't just about investors or, for example, talking about appealing to investors. I think this is an issue that will come up because it runs up against these free speech guidelines that the Trump campaign has made it a point to say we have a very different view. Add to that, you are now seeing this kind of combination of big tech CEOs, very much like we've seen in other countries in the past, and including democracies, Korea, Japan, even India, where national champions are essentially tied up with governments, and governments are far more forward-leaning in terms of talking about those companies' interests when they are engaging with their other counterparts.
This sort of unabashed rivalry that we're talking about, is that something that's always existed, or is it something heightened by the digital age?
I think on the one hand, this is still an allied set of countries. In India's case, a partner of the U.S. But I think they're just differences that aren't to do with necessarily Trump. It is true, going back to the origin of the state here, that there is a skepticism of government that doesn't necessarily exist in India and a number of countries in Europe. Here, almost the origin story is skepticism of power and authority. And so part of that is not giving up, for example, your rights to arms, not giving up the right to the government in terms of how they control speech. And as companies have gone abroad, American companies, they have found that is not necessarily reflective, and it's in fact almost uniquely American. And so I don't think it's just a Trump thing. I think the way that you see this administration, it's partly its approach. It tends to be blunt. It tends to be perhaps heavy-handed. But it also, as I said, what is different is you saw a Biden administration that itself had skepticism of big tech. Here you have an administration that is actually hand in hand with big tech. So I think that might be the difference rather than the free speech kind of rules, which frankly it's a constitutional issue. It's not just a Trump administration issue.
That's one of the confusing bits, Jen Shrady, about the information age is that domestic culture wars kind of become international ones or domestic issues. Now, this has existed for a long time. I remember back in the 1980s, people who were arrested in France asking to be read their rights, and the cops said, well, no, you just saw that in an American television show. We don't read Miranda rights in France. And that was in the 1980s. But it seems as though now all these things that happen in the US kind of come here, especially this mindset of what is the definition, as was just pointed out there by Tanvi, of what is free speech.
It's interesting because I have been collecting a large amount of data in France and the US on this very topic, and just got back some results. And it's pretty dramatic, the difference between French people who say, yes, we want controls over disinformation, versus Americans who are dramatically less likely to say that's true. So on the one hand, yes, there are different histories, different senses of what the state should be doing. But whether or not that has crossed borders, I think it's less about freedom of speech. And I think disinformation really is about big tech benefits, right? They make more money if more posts go viral. And that's what goes viral, something that's very contentious. And also, definitely the spread of the far right. We just saw, a big European event on that. The far right, and Trump is an example of this, really benefits from provocative speech where they can directly not have mediators like journalists and directly speak to people on these platforms. And again, the disinformation is used as a weapon.
And now enter the age of artificial intelligence, Sharad Sharma. And again, picking up on what Jen just said, if what goes viral is what sells and is the business model, then how do you fight against this sort of economic nationalism?
I'm cautiously optimistic. Let me tell you why. First, we are in a forming, norming, storming stage, which is best illustrated by this evolutionary biologist who passed away a few years ago, E.O. Wilson. He said we have a Neolithic brain, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. This has never been the case before. So we got to figure out as a society how to contain this godlike technology. Now, and we are just trying to figure this out. There are many, many experiments taking place, and nobody knows for sure what the answer is. We in India think we have the best answer. Others are also wrestling with this same issue. Now, having said that, the answer, in my opinion, lies in a combination. We use an Indian word for this called jugalbandi. It's a conversation between public goods and private innovation. Ultimately, we got to find out where the boundary is. Where is public goods and where will be private innovation that will allow for techno-legal regulation to happen here? We don't know where the boundary is. Everybody has an opinion. Now, this boundary, I think, will be the Indian model that we are talking about. However, having said that, we have a history of the US always coming late to the party. I'll give you 3 examples. This whole notion of innovation, that you should have public research and private innovation. US embraced this only in July 1945 with Vannevar Bush writing his famous memo, Science, the Endless Frontier. Till then, the US was not on board with this. They for years, for 100 years, they ran toll roads, private toll roads. If you went from a small town, Boonsville, I think it was called, to Washington, D.C., you would pay $39.
That was then, this is now.
They embraced the largest public works project, which resulted in the Interstate Highway in 1955. Right? The fact of the matter is that U.S. never embraced, here in Europe, you saw telecom operators as public utilities. In the US, they saw them for-profit private entities until 1982. The courts intervened and said these will be treated like public utilities. So the US has always been late to the party. And the only way to bring US in is to demonstrate on the ground that an alternative model works. And I think this is where the power of India and France is, that we will demonstrate an alternate model, and then the US will come along for the ride 5, 7, 10 years from now.
The future's unwritten, though. Are we not backtracking, especially when you have a person like Elon Musk who's got, again, one foot in the private sector right now and one foot on the files at the Treasury Department?
Absolutely. I think so. And I think, why are we backtracking?
But is that going to be the model for us? Is that what's going to happen here? Is that what's going to happen in India?
Sure, but the old system was also broken, right? I mean, so we haven't yet found, we're going from one broken system to another broken system, and we got to find a system that truly works as we go forward.
Claude Blanche-Maison?
I completely agree with that. I think we are at a turning point of our evolution, because the AI will come in every sector, by the way. And probably in France, we have a tradition of intervention of the state, which is too much, in fact, interventions and regulations. And we have to find a medium way between the absence of regulation, which is what Mr. Musk and the oligarchs want in America.
Oligarchs?
Yes, that's what the word used by Joe Biden, by the way. He said, you should be careful about the new oligarchy, which is going to take over in the US. And it's very true. We used to take this word oligarch only for Russia, but it exists elsewhere also. And I think Joe Biden was quite right to say that. Be careful of this new oligarchy, which is going to take over in the US, and which was no regulation at all, which is, of course, very dangerous and, I would say, impossible. So we have to find a third way.
Yeah, the fact that there are captains of industry who are close to politicians is nothing new. Here in France, Emmanuel Macron's come under scrutiny for his closeness to Bernard Arnault. In India, Prime Minister Modi and the Adani family, for certain. This, though, with tech, is it different from that?
It is not different, and if I may add to his point, while President Joe Biden did warn the world about this oligarchy, while he was president, did not do very much to stop the growth of big tech in the US, and there wasn't enough in terms of regulation.
Is tech the same as another industry, or is it different?
It is more powerful, because it is more than the sum of its parts. It reaches more people, obviously, and it is going to define where you stand in the global power ladder, I suppose, going forward. And that is why governments and the private sector are working so hard to win this race. And do you need the private sector to be working with the government? In some cases, yes. And every country has a different model. China has a different model where the state is backing these companies with subsidies and with whatever else that they want. The Americans say that they're letting the industry prosper on its own, but we do know that there is enough support, and now you have a co-president in Elon Musk. So it's, you can take a position and say that there is innovation happening on its own, but it's not really happening on its own. There is a lot of support, and when America stops the sale of chips or restricts the sale of chips, it is also helping its own industry and making sure that a certain adversary does not steal the march on them.
Tanvi Madan, is this an unprecedented moment in U.S. history right now and in global history?
It's very dangerous to ask a historian if something is unprecedented. I don't think it's unprecedented that we've seen this closeness of government and business. In fact, if you wanted to find kind of the closest historical analogy to what we've seen from a lot of President Trump in his first few weeks, you could look to President President Johnson years ago, So this closeness of business and government isn't new. I think what is new is tech, as you point out, and these are not just steel barons. These are kind of multinational CEOs whose products and services are in the hands of people around the world. And so this is where you also get the complication of these transnational policies and different cultures and rules, etc. But I do think tech is different. So I think in the fact of even an American government supporting national champions in the way we've seen in other countries and even other democracies, not just Russia and China, is not new. But I do think technology, and it's not like nuclear technology, which stayed in it was high technology. It stayed in the state's hand. This is in all of our hands, so to speak. And so I do think that's where it is unprecedented. And the fact that if you're in France, if you're in India, you are thinking about these rules that were made for the US, or even a specific administration in Washington is taking a different route from its previous administration. This is essentially rule setting that will potentially be transnational and not just in the US. This is something I think governments will think about and have to grapple with.
All of our hands, this new. In the case of Rockefeller, he had control over the oil. Here, with information, it's a bit different. Who controls it? Is it the consumer who controls it, or is it the tech titans who control it?
Certainly, yes. Certainly, we have this history of corporations impacting politicians, but this is so dramatically different. I would like to disagree with a lot of our guests here tonight. There is a coup, literal coup happening in the United States. It's not just whispering, this is a policy that you should undertake, or just the fact that Musk is the wealthiest person on the planet, or that these big tech companies have greater wealth than a lot of different countries. What's happening is if we look at what happened 10 years ago with Edward Snowden, right, where the world really woke up to the surveillance that was happening, right? It wasn't new, but it was phenomenal. Now there's not just the surveillance happening, it's the controlling of our data in terms of in the US, right? So Musk and Trump, et cetera, this private citizen now has complete control over every American's data. And, certainly big tech controls our data, to answer your question, but also, different governments around the world are trying to vie for that as well. But at the end of the day, our data is being sold and controlled by others, and that is hugely problematic.
It's hugely problematic. Is that what was being discussed at this summit or not?
There was, I think, a lot of posturing at the summit. There was definitely, in terms of what was actually signed, there's not a lot of teeth in it, right? There's not a lot of ways to actually implement these, safety or inclusion questions, right? And so it's really pushed those of us in academia or civil society. I launched today with the international panel on the information environment with other scholars, taking this year to really look at what's happening with economic inclusion with that specific goal, right? So it's really up to civil society and others to put some teeth into these safety and inclusion and fairness and transparency guardrails that have been pretty much lifted from big tech.
So picking up on your assertion that there is a quiet coup or a loud coup, I don't know what you want to call it, taking place right now in the United States, is that the shape of things to come? What's stopping that from happening, the temptation from that happening in France, in India?
See, what's happening in the US is a manifestation. It's a symptom of a deeper problem that you alluded to, which is that data privacy has completely dissipated. This didn't happen overnight. This has been happening for the last 20 years, right? And we are seeing the effects of this today.
But picking up on your earlier point, the technology went faster than the humans.
Hold that thought for a minute. Because imagine for a moment our postal service could read every letter and could be a profit-seeking service, not cap profits, not a public utility. Imagine that would be the most powerful company. Imagine if our email service, was profit-seeking and not data blind, it will be very powerful. We created a system which is profit-seeking and not data blind, and therefore has become very powerful. It runs the US state now. Now, the answer to that was in our Prime Minister Modi's speech. I don't know whether people paid attention to that. Because in India, we have chosen to put that entity in the middle as a public utility that is data blind. Now, he used three words that are important. He said that entity is techno-legal regulated, technology and policy. Second, he said that we must use a DPI, digital public infrastructure, to make that happen. Third, he gave an example of that digital public infrastructure. He called it Data Empowerment and Protection Architecture, DEPA. Now, the problem is we have an alternate model, which a few people now in France and other places understand, and hence India as a co-chair and India now hosting the next summit. But I don't think the public as yet have understood this alternate approach that India is bringing to the table. And that alternate approach has to go at the root of what Jen said, that it has to destroy this data surveillance architecture that we allowed the big tech to install in our lives, and now they've become powerful enough to actually run governments for us.
We only found out about the U.S.'s surveillance state because of a whistleblower.
Yes.
It wasn't something that they said, we're going to do this next.
But that is the U.S. state. But don't you think the big tech companies are in bed with the U.S. state?
Right.
Do you think if these big tech companies have
But you're
data
assured
about
that
us,
that wouldn't happen in India?
In fact, I'm asserting that the Indian model prevents that from happening and therefore is the example for the rest of the world to use.
Tanvi Madan, do you agree?
I think there's another kind of, and I'm not sure it's playing out in the same way in the U.S. as it would have in a different administration. But there's a difference here, right? That which was just alluded to. In the U.S., the public sometimes I was part of a study many years ago where we compared European American approaches. The U.S. citizen would be more willing to give up a whole lot of information to the private sector than they would government. So they trusted private sector, or they were getting some benefit from these for-profit companies, but they were skeptical of giving government their data. In Europe and in other countries, we found citizens were more willing to give their data to governments because they thought they got public services, and they were more skeptical of giving it to the private sector. And so what you're finding now is that I think we're about to find out, as Professor Shredi said, that Americans are about to find out that when you have a private sector that not only suddenly has access to your data, but also then ties up with the government. And so consequences, the use of your data is suddenly going to be very different from what you were used to in terms of, okay, I get a free something or the other. But I will say one thing that's different. I think India's model is good for India, perhaps, and for other countries that might have similar views of sovereignty issues or the role of the state. But on the other hand, there might be some countries who actually will find that India's government, so it's big government. It might not be big tech that has access to your data, but big government does. And that's a choice Indians make, and that is how they vote. But other countries might not be as comfortable with that level of surveillance that the government has. Now, one can argue in the US, we're going to be in a situation where both big tech and big government have access to our data. But nonetheless, I don't think, I'm not sure that, for example, in the US, there's going to be a picking up of the Indian model because I think there the question is, it's not like the government doesn't run a state that wants access to data. So it's not that data is entirely protect there. It's perhaps just going to government compared to companies. And India will have its own version of big tech, for instance, and already has that developing over time. So I don't know that we're going to have, even Europe and India have differences amongst each other when it comes to technology. So I think at the granular level, you're going to see some of these philosophical differences about the role of state, the comfort levels come up, not just in terms of the US and the rest of the world, but even between, for example, Europe and India.
Claude Blanche-Maison, that issue of trust is fundamental, whether you trust the private sector more, whether you trust the public sector more. Here in France, I know, for instance, when we have elections, it's the Interior Ministry that gives the results. Nobody questions the Interior Ministry giving the results, not even the most radical parties, and yet in other countries that would be anathema to have the Interior Ministry announce the results.
Yeah, but I think in France we have an emergency. Maybe we should not stick on theoretical problems, whether it is private or public or so. The emergency is to attract investment in data processing. That's exactly what Macron has done during the last days. And it worked after all. He said 100 billion euro, 109, I think, billion euro, and among that 50 from the Emirates, 20 from some
from a Canadian investment firm.
Coming from the Emirates,
Canada.
But also coming from some American company, because you are right. I mean, the American company are looking at their advantage, not exactly what the American government is saying or is counseling, even some UK company also. And why? Why are they keen to come? Because, I mean, they believe that Macron is creating a favorable environment, a business-friendly environment for this kind of business. And also because the energy in France is rather cheap compared to in other place. And
thanks to nuclear power.
And secure, thanks to nuclear power. After all, 70% of our electricity is coming from nuclear power. No one elsewhere in the world at this ratio.
A scramble for data, a scramble for energy. There's also a question over how this innovation will bring a different kind of uncertainty. In the case of India, a country where the services sector currently powers the labor market, the Prime Minister in his speech saying he's aware of that.
Loss of jobs is AI's most feared disruption. But history has shown that work does not disappear due to technology. Its nature changes and new types of jobs are created. We need to invest in skilling and reskilling our people for an AI-driven future.
It's all changing very fast, Palki Sharma, and he's a politician, he's confident. Of course, they're going to be able to skill up, he says. Are people worried, though, in India about the scale at which, first of all, it's a nation that's still moving from the country to the city, and now it's moving to the city, but perhaps not in the jobs it thought it was going to be moving to?
I think Indians are quite excited about AI. If you look at the rankings on AI adoption, India ranks among the top countries. Having said that, jobs and skilling is a problem that is not unique to India. That is a challenge that governments the world over will have to deal with, including in India, especially in India, because we have a young population and we have millions of young people entering the job market every year. So the government will have to be that much more mindful in its policy making to ensure that all those people are accommodated. To that extent, yes, there is a problem. But like the Prime Minister said, and if you look at history, technology comes, it disrupts the job market, new jobs are created, and we will have to find a way to do that.
Sometimes there's deindustrialization. The jobs never come back.
Some other kinds of jobs come.
Jen Trady?
Yeah, I think that this is really the missing piece. As I was mentioning before, what we did not hear this past week is how the poor, people with less education, were going to fare in this new AI system. The focus does tend to be on this broad statement that either it's going to bring a lot of jobs or it's going to put a lot of people out of work. But any kind of really detailed understanding of how AI systems in particular affect people with lower levels of education, for example, that don't have a LinkedIn profile, right? There are all these AI ways that financial institutions, employers kind of scrape online data and really can therefore discriminate against people. So I think there's so many implications that have to do with employment that are more than just jobs or no jobs in a broad sense, but how people with fewer resources are excluded from the AI economy is something that
we don't know the
we
answer.
need to study. We need to. Well, we do know that people are discriminated against, and it's a problem. But we do need a lot more research and policy action on it.
All right. So too soon to say you're stating on that. Sharad Sharma, the summit co-hosted by France and India. Is that just because these are two leaders who have, it's transactional to things that they want from each other? Is it, defense contracts, services sector contracts, this kind of thing? Or is it vis-a-vis this repositioning when it comes to the other big superpowers in this race, the United States and China?
Look, I work in the kitchen. I'm not in the media, right? So I can tell you there is something cooking in the kitchen that is important for the rest of the world. And I'll give you an example. And I think this is a false binary that we trust the private sector or the government. We shouldn't trust either. And I think that is the India model. I take a flight, let's say, from Bangalore to Delhi. Palki is in Delhi. I would use a face recognition system to enter the airport. I feel hungry. I pay for my snack at Bangalore airport. I land in Delhi. I pay for my Uber, in Delhi. Now, the question that I ask is, does Government of India know how many flights I've taken? Although there is a public element in it, there is techno-legal protection that the government does not know. I could go into details, but I don't have time to do that. Does our payment regulator know that I changed cities because one payment was in Bangalore, the other one is in Delhi? The answer is no. The protection is not merely legal. It is part of public technology and public policy. So if they want to change that, they'll have to take the public protocol and rewrite it. If they rewrite it, hundreds of companies will know about it. And, Palki will talk about it and others will talk about it in India. And you can't do it in secret. Now, if I paid for it from my bank account, that bank account used the digital identity system in India. Therefore, does the digital identity system know how many bank accounts I have? The answer is no. There is a legal protection and there is a public technology protection. Now, this approach of techno-legal does not give any special power to the government, any special power to
Do India and the European Union speak the same language on this?
I think increasingly there are powerful, well-regarded people here in France who understand the power of this approach. Because as I mentioned, this is not an Indian approach. This is an approach that started in France in the past with the idea of digital commons and data commons. We are building on that legacy that was created in France and is now being built further in India. And therefore, there is a value system, architecture, collaboration that is going to be significant. So what you don't see behind the scenes is this coalescing around this third approach, which is not talked about a lot, which should be talked about a lot, and I hope will be talked about a lot. And that will then result in a kind of a alternative that we're talking about, rather than this false binary, trust the private sector or trust the government.
All right, we'll continue definitely to talk about it. I want to thank you, Sharad Sharma. I want to thank Jen Shredi, Palki Sharma, Claude Branche-Maison, Tanvi Madan for being with us from Washington. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.